Even though Campbelltown District High School was a pioneering enterprise school in the 1980s, its program still represents some of the more mature and sophisticated practices that characterise enterprise programs today. The Campbelltown experiment initiated what was to become known as enterprising education, at the heart of which is an enterprising pedagogy, where students use initiative, resourcefulness, problem-solving and other enterprising skills in the way they learn. This student enterprise program grew out of an Australian government equity initiative to encourage the retention of disadvantaged students in Tasmania.
Nice to see you again, Glenn, after all these years.
Yeah, it's good.
And thanks for agreeing to do the interview. You instigated and led the student enterprise program at Campbelltown District High School nearly 30 years ago. Revolutionised that school. I was hoping to record some of your insights and memories, because I think that they are very important to teach some of our schools these days who want to follow a enterprising pathway.
Okay.
Can you tell me how the program started?
Right, it started with one project called Overflow with Info, and I basically had 12 students. It was 1987, and they were all grade 10, so 15 or 16-year-olds, learning computer studies. And the task I had was to get around all of the staff and teach them basically how to use a computer system, because they'd never seen one before. And I had trouble doing that, so I said to the kids, can you teach other classes, other teachers, students, the skills I'm teaching you, and we'll have a bit of a go at that. So it started off that, so I gave them a little bit of power and a challenge. And after they'd finished teaching that, they just wanted to keep running with it and form an actual formal group.
So this was basically a tutoring enterprise?
It started that way, yeah.
I remember one of the most striking features about the entire program, that it was a school-wide integrated approach. Can you tell me some of the features of that approach?
That's right. Our school was, we basically started at grade 3, went through to grade 10. So you covered that sort of age group. And we're also looking at not just one subject area. So sometimes my students would go into an English class, show a bit of word processing, go into a maths class, show some numeracy programs to some of the students and teach them. So it was that sort of approach, and the rest of the school could, actually watch this happening, and the other teachers watched this happening as well. So they could see this. Hey, this is a new way to teach kids, and they could see the motivation, and that it was curriculum linked. It was linked into what I had to teach to these students anyway, and assess them. So it was that sort of model that started just with one project, and everybody could sit and watch. But it's still, I had to deliver a curriculum, and I had to assess it.
So the curriculum focus was very important.
Oh, it was totally driven by that. I had a professional development requirement to help these teachers get up to speed, but I had to teach these kids to do the exact same skill base.
So it was a cascading tutoring technique you used?
That's the technique that I call it, yeah. And that happened at a classroom level too, because I asked the students to teach 2 or 3 students and get them then to teach the next 2 or 3 each. So it was a cascade within the classroom as well as within each grade from my students.
One of the key features of the program was a very strong focus on curriculum. Can you tell us a bit about that?
That was something where I'd meet with the students, and we had a mechanism for making sure that was very clear, and that was the curriculum was the focus. And we'd meet probably every week, sit down, people would come and present evidence, and sometimes argue the case that they'd met the indicators or hadn't, so it was an interesting discussion, or I'd want more. So we'd have that sort of bargaining process. But the other students were listening too, so there was a fair amount of peer assessment in it as well, to whether somebody had met the requirements as well. So we'd have those weekly meetings reflecting on the evidence that was needed to satisfy the curriculum. So there was a total curriculum framework, around the project that we're doing. And it didn't matter what as other enterprises started up, they adopted the same approach. So I think that's why teachers were comfortable with it too. So it became a management tool, for delivering your curriculum and assessment. So those two things went together, the delivery and the assessment went together, and with the students coming with you and being totally involved in the process.
So there's formal assessment, and there was there also peer assessment and self-assessment going on at the same time?
Yeah, all three.
All three.
All three, and they'd bring that to the meeting, so they'd self-assess themselves before they got there because they knew the meeting was going to happen each week. And at the end of the process, some of them were chairing the meeting. I chaired it to start with. But they knew that my decision was the final decision. I had to have the responsibility of the final decision. And
that's always a problem when often educators think about self-assessment and peer assessment. They, in some way, it can have overtones that I lose control or authority over the final assessment. But
Now, the students understood that. In fact, this is a harder assessment process than just giving a test, etc., etc. And there were still formal examinations at the end of the year anyway. So these students still had to sit whatever the external, if there was an external component, they still had to pass that. But this process, no, they understood that was my responsibility. But they had the power to argue their case and put evidence there, and so did their peers. And sometimes they were harder than I would have been. They actually were harder on themselves from memory and harder on each other than I would have been. And sometimes I had to say, well, I think that's the level of evidence that's exceeded what I require.
So what was the overall impact of this approach in terms of curriculum progress with the students?
The course I was teaching at the time was basically a 2-year course in computer science. They finished it in a year. Every one of them finished it within 12 months. So then they could look at what else they could do. Some of them wanted to go and help other students with their enterprises and teach them the same approach with the extra time. Some of them did extra electives that they'd wanted to do that couldn't squeeze in, so they got extra options because of their progress. And there was a couple that decided to go off and start their higher education, still stay at school, and they contacted other colleges that they would have gone to the next year and negotiated, because they were pretty good negotiators, a pathway to start their year 11 early.
So when you say they were pretty good negotiators, we're not talking about academic, well-versed students, are we, in this case?
They were an average, I've been at that school 10 years, and they were an average academically gifted set of students. They were just your average group.
So how did the program expand through the school and the curriculum? Right? And can you give us some examples of that?
It was fairly quick. Within about 6 months of the initial project that we did with Overflow, we had one start up in the metalwork room, where a teacher decided, instead of everybody making the same piece of metal fabrication, they'd all build a trailer together, because the skill base was exactly the same. They could tick off welding, grinding, and actually produce something, sell it, and have their picture taken proudly next to what they'd created. Same set of skills, so we had that teacher looked at the approach and went, well, I'd enjoy that too, and let's go, and the kids were right into that. There was another one, agricultural science teacher, had to teach a bit of seed propagation. Went out and got some of the native species, collected the seed, collected a whole lot of old cans around the school. The younger students did that, cut the tops off, had everybody packing mulch into it, and seed raising mix, putting the seeds in, built a little polytunnel, and the local Lions Club, local service club helped build the polytunnel, and then planted them out in all of the old people's homes around the area. So complete from a bit of recycling, bit of botany, bit of construction, bit of everything. That was a terrific one.
And were there any other types of enterprises?
Yes, we started after a while getting some service enterprises. A couple of the teachers from the social science commerce area thought that was a good suggestion. Some of the kids took it up. One of those that really surprised us was a group of students that wanted to start their own credit union of financial services and provide financial services to other students, groups that wanted to do enterprises, because they need a little bit of funding to get started. And they wrote their own rules, and the student group had to apply to them, and they could use teachers to assist them and learn how to prepare an application, but teachers couldn't be part of the application process. They could support, but not do. And then they also struck a variable interest rate. They encouraged social enterprises with a social outcome for the school or the community. If it was more of a commercial one to make some money, then the interest rate was higher, and then they also had to show what they would do with their profit, how they would put that back into the school or back into their own education. So none of the money ever went to the students. They had to go back into their own education or back into the school. So they had their own logos, they developed their own T-shirts, and they were there to service the financial needs of all the other enterprises that might want to start. The credit union had a major spin-off too, and encouraged just wider thinking. Other students knew they could get a grant to get started, and there was a process that they could understand. Besides expanding their thinking, basically expanded the number of enterprises we had too, full stop. It had a practical effect of expanding that thinking, providing the application process, getting the finance, and all of a sudden we had like 15 or 16 enterprises in a very small school of 230 students.
Was there any particular loans or student groups which were of particular interest?
Yeah, there was a couple of times where I sat in on the meetings to hear reports coming back from groups that had loans, and some of them hadn't quite hit the targets. And it was interesting to see the reaction of the funding body versus the pseudo bank management meeting versus the who's got the loan, and they had to negotiate some maybe new targets and things like that. So that was the quality of the conversation, that really adult conversation in the language that was appropriate to their age group. But that's what I found interesting, just to listen to that conversation. And they would negotiate new targets, new reporting requirements, and or even discuss what they might do next. So it was really a strategic sort of planning was what was going on, and reporting. So that was really interesting to watch, and an unexpected outcome. The other effect that it had is we were a small country school. We didn't have all the skills within the teaching staff, and one of the good examples, we didn't have a bookkeeping teacher. So one of the students got one of their parents to come in and teach them the bookkeeping that they needed to do. Now that's pretty well unheard of. Most secondary school students at that age, teenagers, do not want their parents coming as parent help. But they went and actually got them. And they went and got, I think they got the local mayor at one stage to come and talk to them about public speaking, because most of them had no clue and a fear of public speaking. So they were starting to bring the community in for specific roles, and the community thought that was absolutely fantastic, that they were involved in the delivery and teaching. It's a very old model that some of the elders and that in the community bring their skills to the younger generation. That's what started to happen, and it was driven by the students. So that was unexpected too, but it was brilliant to watch. And they still remember it, because I still see some of those parents who are now grandparents, and they still remember getting that invitation.
The program went further and expanded it outside the school and outside the curriculum. I do remember a story of students on their way home on the school bus using egg cartons to practice their keyboard skills. Now, what was that all about?
That was an approach that was made to me by a local community education centre. And they used to run night classes in all sorts of things. And I used to teach beginning computing for adults. And they'd heard about Overflow with Info. So they approached the kids, and then the kids approached me to actually take that course. And their parents enrolled, and they actually got the contract. So they actually had the contract to deliver that course for 6 weeks, for about 3 hours every Tuesday night. I was there, but they took the course, they developed the lesson plans, and they had to do it according to an outside agency's requirements. They had to meet the same requirements that I used to have to meet to be employed that way. And then the money they put back into their enterprise account to then do other things with.
And there was also an undertaking called the Technofest, I think. What was that about?
That was another one. There was a festival for just about everything around the area, and the kids came up, well, we'll have a Technofest. So they started by gathering all the technology they could think of, right back to old wind-up record players, right through to modern computers, took over the school library for two nights and a couple of days, made sure every student went, every teacher went through an exhibition. So there was about 6 or 7 stalls there. They had to man all the stalls, do the presentations, and then they invited the television studio to come and film it. One thing they forgot to do was check the education department's manual on inviting the media into a school. So the principal was put on the spot a bit, but he got some permissions very quickly, and they learned about those sort of protocols in future. But it was fantastic and broadcast around the state.
Did they get many attendees?
We worked out that there was 1,000 people lived in that local town, and a few came from outside. They got about 300 people come to that event. So that was a fantastic turn-up.
Around this time, the State Student Enterprise Program funded a group of your students to run a state conference on student enterprise.
That's right.
Well, that was rather unusual. How was it managed?
The students formed an enterprise to actually run that one event. So it didn't need to be a year type project as an enterprise. It was just one event. They set it up the same way as they'd run their other enterprises, with group meetings, planning, and they also had They had charge of the funding to allocate it. I had to approve of it, but they approached other schools and other student groups through their student representative councils to come to the conference, and the students had to apply for the funds to bring a teacher. So the teacher didn't automatically get to come unless the students invited them from another school. They had to bring a teacher. So it was managed on an enterprise basis because they were used to doing that by now. Because of the results from the state conference, right from overflow, having a credit union, the amount of activity in our school was such that students were starting to request that the school be open longer at the end of the day, so they could basically get more of their enterprise work done or more of their school work done. And even requests for weekend access to the computer system, to other resources, so they could basically keep learning. Now that was unheard of, and a massive change to the way of teaching, learning, and just that motivation level, but that we don't normally see with students. That was to us one of the revolutionary things there, was that engagement and the motivation level.
I want to talk about the notion of thin participation, as I call it, which plagues a lot of the enterprise-based projects. It essentially means that with large groups of students, particularly class size, there is not enough activity and therefore responsibility to go around the entire group. There's a big challenge. How did you deal with it?
Right, we set that up from the start, so the students understood that they could pick people that they wanted to do a role. They could start with their strengths. And we'd do a skills audit basically at the start to who can do what and who wants to learn what. So we'd sort out the initial roles, but we also made it quite clear that you have to teach somebody else. You have to have at least one shadow. So there duplicates a whole lot of other roles. And we also had a role recycling as well, cycling around. So you train the next person that might do your role for a while. And if they need a bit of support, it wouldn't be me, it'd be the other person who's done the job.
Did they do different roles, as in rotation, or just recycling?
It was a role rotation, and because they were also being shadowed, that was the next person that was going to step up and try that role. So over time, they got to try quite a few different roles. Might start with their strengths where they were confident, because we'd done those skills audits. I'm confident here, but I need to learn some of those other skills. So you shadow somebody for a while. So you might have a couple of roles going on at once. So we just deliberately set up all our enterprises with that discussion at the start, that this is what we're going to do. So you learn a broad range of skills. Plus we'd look back at the curriculum and go, well, you've got to learn all of these skills. You can do some of those through that role, some through this role. So you had to do role rotation. So we also had a saying, we take no passengers. Everybody's got a part to play in this enterprise to make it work well. And that worked really, really well. Just having those 2 or 3 concepts explained from the start.
You also used managing groups for quality assurance processes. Can you give me some details on that?
With most of the enterprises, we actually broke them up into some sort of, I suppose, subcommittees or management groups. Some would look after promotions. We had a small promotions group within Overflow with Info when it got bigger. We had another one that was the finance committee, for want of a better word. And then they would report back to the main group. So we started to build a management structure under some of the longer term enterprises, some that were going to go maybe all year or 6 months. So there was another reporting structure and basically teaching them what you've got to do when you leave school, either in community enterprises or as a citizen or in a business. So we started to have those management groups there as well. Yeah.
From my recollection, you also had what could be termed a satellite approach, where coming from the main core enterprise, in this case the Overflow one,
that's right,
students in that group could pick mini enterprises, micro enterprises, which would spawn off out of the major activity?
Yep, they could do that, and some of them were still part of the main activity, especially if there was an interest. It was an interest-based level. Somebody's fired up about a certain direction, and the rest of the group thought, well, yes, and you've got time. We'd look at the resources we had. You can go do that. It had come back to the main group when it was finished, or sometimes it potted off and became its own enterprise. And the one I mentioned previously with the cans and the propagating the seeds actually came out of that one and became its own entity after a while.
So that in effect provided a lot more activity and responsibility and helped overcome the thin participation
for sure.
dilemma.
And some students were not interested in the info tech stuff that we were doing, but they're interested in the plant propagation. So it gave an avenue. Yeah, that's your strength, that's your interest. So there was something, basically, at the end of the day, there was something for everybody.
The role of the teacher must have been very important in this whole program. What was the role of the teacher and how did it evolve?
Evolve's the right word, Paul, because it started off fairly traditional. Teacher explaining, running, running the meetings, showing them how to do it, providing exemplars. Then over time, as the students became more competent, it was different with different age levels. You could just judge, and that's where the skill of a teacher is, to judge when to let go, when they're competent, when to move back out. The end with overflow, they had their meeting procedure, they had the people who chose who would chair the meeting. I ended up as an item that said teacher's advice, teacher advisor. And I was on the end of the list there. They consult me if they wanted to during the meeting, but otherwise I was able to, after a period of time, sit back and let them run it at that age and at that group. So teachers in general, when they ran their enterprises, worked the same way. Start off by explaining it all, setting up the framework, explaining the curriculum and assessment that has to go with it, and then gradually working back as the students became more competent. And that worked across all of the enterprises. Once I modelled it for the first lot, some teachers were very reluctant to do that. They'd been used to a different model of teaching for many years. But they saw the model, got comfortable with it, saw the outcomes, the student outcomes convinced them that this was a good thing to do. And we were really pleased with the sort of, the idea of a separation of powers came up at one stage, that there's the normal power of the teacher. I'm going to give you this bit. You take responsibility for that. I'll let you have that bit of power, but this is where I have to have the final judgments, as a teacher. That's my job.
Interesting, because I saw in some schools around this time position descriptions being developed for teachers and students.
Yes.
And it sort of gave rise to this notion, right, of the separation of powers or role sharing. And it seemed to me to be distilled into the notion that students were primarily responsible for the action, and teachers were primarily responsible for quality assuring the learning. Yes. Is that how you would see your?
That's exactly how it ended up, which it has to. And the students understood that's the teacher's job. The other thing that they really understood was the expertise of their teachers. They actually appreciated the expertise their teachers did have when they had to run things themselves and make their own progress. They really started to appreciate the skill the teachers had. So there was a respect. Actually, you could see the respect grow from a lot of students we didn't have too much respect from when we started.
Just as an aside, following what you've just said, I'd just like to underscore that notion of teaching students before they actually are asked to undertake tasks. A classic one, for instance, you mentioned before, was demonstrating and teaching the students explicitly how to run a meeting. Too often these days of experiential learning, it becomes discovery, and we hope that the students, by doing it, are actually going to learn it, which in some ways, at best, right, is inefficient, and at worst, ineffective. Would you agree with that notion?
Oh, that'd be spot on. Because you're trying to do both. You're trying to give them a framework where they can succeed at the first, so that's why you do that bit of explicit teaching, and then let them try it and modify it and improve it, so they basically succeed from the first time that they do it and feel that success. So I totally agree with that. I just wouldn't put them in an experiential situation to learn something significant like that.
at the state education department level, we undertook our own evaluation of enterprise activities around the state. Was there any follow-up with these students longitudinally?
Yes, there was. It was about 10 years after they left school. It was the Australian government wanted them followed up to see how different those students were from having that initial enterprise experience. So I found most of them, I found a good dozen of them, and it was astounding what we found, because I'd been at that school for 10 years and most students in that area stayed in that area. These students were spread all over the world. Not one of them actually stayed in their area. They've been very mobile geographically. Half of them had university degrees, and the average was 10% at that school over time, not 50%. And what they'd done to get those qualifications was they'd realised when they needed a qualification, they worked out how to go and get it. So they realised they needed it for something. So that was the motivation. Not one of them went straight on to university, but they went and got that within that 10 years. They went and got qualified at what they needed. So they're very strategic as far as planning their further education. The other bit of feedback I got was generally from their work experience. When they first started work, they changed jobs a fair bit. They weren't happy with a few employers that didn't recognise their skill base, that they could do more than what the employers would let them do.
That's fascinating.
So they changed jobs. They found an employer that would appreciate their skill base and work from there. And the other one that I wasn't expecting is, we talked about just generally, and it wasn't a set of questions, we just, what are you doing and how's your life worked out? Their relationships with other people, their interpersonal skills and their choices in relationships were all very, I suppose you'd call steady, really good respectful relationships between young men and young women. They'd made good choices socially as well.
So would it be fair to say that in effect they were in charge of their lives, these young
Basically,
people?
they had continued planning from that original experience, knew how to plan, whether it was personally, with work, or whatever they wanted to do, or whether it was their education. So to me that was absolutely outstanding, and that's the test, longitudinally, isn't it, when you look 10 years later.
In conclusion, Glenn, I want to ask you some advice for other teachers, right?
Okay.
I'm lucky enough, Glenn, to have seen over the last 30 years enterprise-based projects all around the world, primary, secondary and even at tertiary levels. When I think back at the Campbell District High School approach, an under-resourced school, a rural school in a struggling community, I think I can't help but be underwhelmed by some of the stuff I see today. It's in some ways it's pale, it's narrow in its focus. I don't want to be overcritical about this, but the big problem is it's marginal. It's failed to get from the sideshow, as Enterprise has, to the main tent. One of the major achievements of the Campbelltown District High School one is that it was a whole school approach, which did envelop the curriculum and all other non-curriculum activities in the school. Besides that, what particular advice would you give teachers?
Well, I think they have to, from what you've said, Paul. We had to think beyond just one project. You know, you've got to think beyond one, it's just a project or it's just this. And it is a way of delivering the curriculum. So you're dead right with what you said. So there's got to be a curriculum focus. It's got to be more than just a project to keep kids busy. It's got to be genuine so they engage. You've got to have a role for everybody. So that's that thin, avoid the thin participation that we were talking about. You have to avoid that so that everybody can be engaged in it. And I suppose you've just got to, as a teacher, you've got to get used to that power sharing and define that power sharing, take it slowly and gradually see what your students can do. And that's the last piece of advice I'll give people as well. Don't underestimate what your students can do, because they surprised us that many times. After they'd met the curriculum requirements, they totally exceeded interpersonal skills that weren't on the curriculum, all sorts of other learning that occurred. So don't underestimate the youngest or the oldest in what they can do.
It was the students themselves who became one of the most powerful forces in the entire endeavour. By harnessing their enthusiasm and renewed sense of power, they not only convinced themselves of the value of education, but also those around them. This approach prospers when teachers share power. There is a balance between first-hand and second-hand learning. Collaboration is strategic and reflection is central.